It is the summer of 334 BC. Alexander the Great is 22 years old, and he has just torn the Persian army apart at the river Granicus. Blood is still drying on the blades of his Macedonian phalanx. The Greek world is trembling. The Persian Empire is rattled. Every city from the Hellespont to Ephesus is throwing open its gates, and then he stops. Not because he is afraid, not because he is tired, but because of one man, one city, one problem he cannot simply ride around: Halicarnassus. Carved into a natural harbour on the southwest coast of Asia Minor, this city is no ordinary fortress. The Persians have poured everything into it, strengthened its walls, carved a massive ditch before them, flooded its garrison with thousands of hardened soldiers, and handed command to the most dangerous mind Alexander has ever faced: Memnon of Rhodes, a Greek, fighting for the enemy. And he is brilliant. For over 2 months the city will bleed Alexander's army dry. His siege towers will burn, his soldiers will be hurled back from walls they cannot breach, his men will bleed before a ditch they cannot cross. One night 2 drunk soldiers will nearly collapse the entire campaign, and when it's finally over, when Alexander's army finally smashes through, Memnon will have slipped beyond his reach. The city will be ash, and the young king who never loses will be staring at the ruins of what should have been a triumph, holding nothing but cinders. This is not the story of a great Macedonian victory. This is the story of the siege that came closest to ending Alexander's legend before it truly began. This is the brutal truth of Halicarnassus. Welcome to Wars in History. This channel exists to cut through the myths and give you the raw, unfiltered reality of warfare throughout the ages. Hit that subscribe button now and ring the bell so you never miss an upload. If you're already part of this community, thank you. Drop a comment below and tell me, do you think Memnon of Rhodes was the greatest strategic mind Alexander ever faced? I want to hear your take, and here is something special for you. We have put together a free War Room map pack, 10 battles that changed the course of history, fully mapped and ready for you to download instantly. It is called 10 Battles That Changed History, and you can grab it right now from the link in the description or the pinned comment below, completely free, no catch, just good history. Go get it. Now, let us go back to 334 BC to see why Halicarnassus mattered so much, why Alexander could not simply bypass it and race deeper into the Persian Empire. We first need to look at the kind of war he was actually fighting. When Alexander crossed the Hellespont into Asia in May of 334 BC, he brought with him an army of approximately 30,000 infantry and 5,000 cavalry. It was a formidable force, battle-hardened and fanatically loyal to their king. But Alexander had a weakness so glaring that his own generals could see it clearly. He had almost no navy. His fleet of roughly 160 ships was laughably outmatched by the vast Persian armada that patrolled the Aegean Sea. The Persians did not just own the water, they weaponized it. From their port cities along the western coast of Asia Minor, they could funnel gold, recruits, and political poison directly into the Greek city-states back home, stirring up rebellion behind Alexander's back while he was thousands of miles away chasing glory. A revolt in Greece would not just distract Alexander, it would destroy him. It would cut his supply lines, drain his treasury, and strand his army in a foreign land with no way home. This was the strategic trap Memnon of Rhodes had identified long before Alexander ever set foot in Asia. Memnon had actually advised the Persian commanders before the Battle of Granicus to avoid open battle entirely, to deny Alexander the kind of war he wanted and let hunger, time, and the Persian fleet do the work. The Persian satraps, too proud and too arrogant to listen to a Greek mercenary, ignored him. They paid for that arrogance in blood at the Granicus River, where Alexander shattered their army and left thousands of their soldiers dead or captured at a cost of barely 100 of his own men. After the disaster, it was Memnon who gathered the broken remnants of the Western Persian army and fell back south, organized and intact. Sardis fell. Ephesus fell. Persian resistance stiffened again at the port city of Miletus, where the city was garrisoned heavily and the defenders waited for the Persian fleet. Miletus fell too, but the wider Persian strategy did not collapse, and so, by August of 334 BC, Memnon, the Persian satrap Orontobates, and the Persian high command had made a decision. Orontobates held the political authority in Caria, but Memnon was the military brain of the defence. They would not run again. They would make their stand at the greatest, most heavily fortified city on the western coast of the empire. A city with walls that had been strengthened beyond anything Alexander had yet encountered. A city with a harbour that kept the Persian fleet, and therefore endless supplies, permanently at the defenders' backs. A city that sat at the heart of the strategically vital region of Caria. That city was Halicarnassus, the capital of Caria, home to one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world and soon to become the bloodiest, most gruelling battlefield of Alexander's early campaign. To take it, Alexander would need more than courage. He would need patience, engineering, and a tolerance for losses he had never been tested on before. And even then, even after all of it, he would not get everything he came for. It is June of 334 BC. The dust has barely settled on the banks of the river Granicus, and the ravens are still circling. Alexander the Great, 22 years old and burning with a fury that older men found genuinely unsettling, stands over what remains of the Persian Western Army. Thousands of Darius's men lie dead or captured after the battle. His own losses, by contrast, are almost embarrassing in their smallness. Barely 100 men. To the watching world, the message is clear. This Macedonian boy king is not a footnote. He is a force of nature. But Alexander does not celebrate for long. He never does. Granicus had broken the Persian army in the field, but it had not solved the real strategic problem. The Persian fleet still ruled the Aegean, and every fortified harbour on the coast remained a dagger pointed at his rear. If those ports stayed open, Persian gold and agents could still reach Greece, rebellion could still erupt behind him, and the war could still be lost while Alexander was marching deeper into Asia. This was not a hypothetical concern. This was the exact strategy that the most dangerous man in the Persian Empire had been pushing for months. His name was Memnon of Rhodes, and if you have not heard of him before today, pay very close attention, because this man came closer to ending Alexander the Great than any Persian general, any king or any army ever did. Memnon of Rhodes was born around 380 BC on the island of Rhodes, and from the very beginning his life was anything but conventional. His brother Mentor had entered Persian service and been given land in the Troad, the northwestern corner of Asia Minor. Memnon followed him there. Through his brother's connections and his own formidable military talent, Memnon rose steadily in Persian service, building a reputation as a tactician of rare brilliance and a commander of absolute cool nerve. He married into the Persian nobility through Barsin, the daughter of the Persian satrap Artabazus. She had first been married to Memnon's brother Mentor, and after Mentor's death became Memnon's wife, binding him even more deeply to one of the most powerful Persian noble families in Asia Minor. His relationship with the Macedonian world is one of history's great ironies. When Artabazus rebelled against the Persian king Artaxerxes III in the 350s BC and the revolt failed, both Artabazus and Memnon were forced to flee. Where did they go? To Pella, the royal capital of Macedonia. They lived there as guests at the court of King Philip II, Alexander's father. During those years in Pella, the young Alexander was being tutored by Aristotle, and it is almost certain that he and Memnon crossed paths. The future conqueror of Asia and his future greatest adversary may have sat at the same tables, walked the same corridors, and breathed the same Macedonian air. Memnon knew Macedonia. He knew how Philip built his army. He understood the Macedonian phalanx not as an abstraction, but as something he had studied up close, at the source. When Mentor secured pardons for the rebels from the Persian king, and Memnon returned to service, he brought that knowledge with him. He knew exactly how the Macedonian war machine worked, what its strengths were, and, crucially, what its weaknesses were. That knowledge would define his entire strategy against Alexander. In 336 BC, before Alexander had even crossed into Asia, Memnon was already fighting the Macedonians. When Parmenion, the only general King Philip fully trusted, led a vanguard force into Asia Minor as a preliminary to the planned invasion, it was Memnon who defeated him. He cornered Parmenion's forces in the northwest of modern Turkey, isolated them, and neutralized the advance. He proved, before the main war had even started, that he understood how to fight this enemy. Then came the full invasion, in 334 BC, when Alexander led his army across the Hellespont and the Persian satraps in Western Asia. Minor gathered to decide what to do about this new threat. It was Memnon who laid out the strategy that might have stopped everything. He stood before the assembled Persian commanders and told them, "Do not fight him in the open, not yet. Burn the crops ahead of his march, destroy the horse pastures, empty the granaries, poison the wells if you have to, deny Alexander's army the ability to feed itself off the land, and within weeks his men will be hungry, his horses will be dying, and this invasion will collapse under its own weight. The Macedonians are short of money, short of ships, and short of time. Make time the weapon." The Persian satraps listened, and then they did the opposite. They found the advice insulting. This Greek mercenary, this foreigner, telling them to retreat, to burn their own territory, to yield the field without a fight. Their pride would not allow it. They chose to meet Alexander in open battle at the river Granicus, convinced that their superior numbers and their cavalry would crush him at the waterline before he could deploy his full strength. The result was a catastrophe, thousands dead or captured. The Western Persian army broken and shattered. After the disaster at the Granicus, the Persian high command did not make the same mistake again. Memnon was right, and they all knew it. He was given the reins of the remaining Persian forces in the west, and told to do whatever was necessary. He immediately did what he had always wanted to do. He stopped fighting on Alexander's terms and started fighting on his own. Memnon fell back south with the remnants of the Western army. He did not panic. He did not scatter. He retreated in good order, gathering broken units as he went, reorganizing and stabilizing his force as he withdrew. He garrisoned Ephesus, one of the largest cities on the Ionian coast, and waited to see what Alexander would do. When Alexander came, Memnon looked at the approaching storm of Macedonian spears and cavalry, and made the hard, rational decision to abandon Ephesus without a fight. Not because he was beaten, but because he was not ready yet, and he was not going to waste his men on a battle he had not chosen. Persian resistance stiffened again further south, at Miletus. The city was garrisoned heavily under Hegesistratus, and the whole defence depended on the Persian fleet arriving in time to give the defenders the superiority they needed to hold. He came excruciatingly close. Alexander's Admiral Nicanor beat the Persian fleet to the harbour by the margin of a single tide, blockading it just hours before the massive Persian armada arrived. Cut off from reinforcement by sea, the defenders held Miletus for as long as they could. When the walls finally crumbled under the relentless battering of Macedonian siege engines and the city fell, the wider Persian strategy survived. Memnon remained free, and Alexander still had not destroyed the mind behind the coastal defence. And now, as the summer of 334 BC reaches its burning peak, Memnon has retreated to his last best card. He has fallen back to the strongest fortress on the entire western coast of the Persian Empire, a city of enormous wealth, cultural prestige, and military impregnability. A city protected by walls so thick and towers so tall that veterans who had fought across the known world looked at them and felt doubt creeping up their spines. A city whose harbour gave Memnon a permanent, unbreakable link to the Persian fleet, and therefore to unlimited supply, unlimited reinforcement, and unlimited time. That city was Halicarnassus, and this is where Memnon decided to make Alexander pay. To understand what Alexander was walking into, you need to understand what Halicarnassus actually was. This was not simply a fortified town. This was the capital of Caria, one of the ancient world's most strategically critical regions, occupying a commanding position on a natural harbour on the southwestern coast of Asia Minor, in what is today the modern Turkish city of Bodrum. It was a city of staggering cultural significance, home to one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, the mausoleum of Halicarnassus, the monumental tomb of the Carian king Mausolus, so grand and so beautiful that the word mausoleum itself was born from it, and has echoed down through human history ever since. But Halicarnassus was not just a cultural monument. It was a military fortress of the First Order. The Persians had spent years and vast resources strengthening it. The walls were thick, tall, and reinforced with towers at regular intervals. 3 heavily fortified gates, the Melassa Gate on the west, the Mindus Gate to the northwest, and the Triple-moat Gate to the east, controlled access to the city, each one guarded, reinforced, and defended in depth. On either side of the harbour stood two separate citadels, Salmacis to the west and Arconassus to the east. These were not just towers or watchtowers, they were full fortress complexes, in their own right, each one capable of sustaining an independent defence even if the main city walls were breached. In the worst-case scenario, even if Alexander smashed through the outer walls and poured his army into the city, Memnon's men could fall back into those citadels and continue fighting indefinitely, resupplied from the sea. And surrounding all of it, the single most daunting obstacle Alexander had yet encountered in his entire campaign was the moat. Not a simple ditch, not a shallow trench dug in a hurry by nervous men. This was a massive engineered killing ground, approximately 30 cubits wide and 15 cubits deep, roughly 40 to 45 feet across and more than 20 feet deep, carved into the earth around the city walls with the precision of men who intended it to stop an army cold. Imagine that for a moment. A ditch that, if you were standing at the bottom, the rim above your head would be the height of a modern two-story building. And across the entire width of that ditch, 40 feet of open, empty air, you would have to cross under fire carrying equipment, surrounded by the screaming chaos of battle, with every defender on the walls above you hurling every missile, every boulder, every burning projectile they possessed directly onto your head. It was not a moat, it was a death trap. The garrison that awaited Alexander inside those walls was equally formidable. Memnon had filled Halicarnassus with many thousands of defenders, Persian regulars, Greek mercenaries hardened by years of campaigning, and local Carian and Ionian fighters loyal to the Persian cause, with some later estimates placing the force as high as 30,000. The Persian fleet, anchored in the harbour at his back, guaranteed that food, weapons, water and fresh troops could flow into the city continuously. Unlike Alexander, who was operating at the end of a long and increasingly fragile supply chain, stretching back across Asia Minor to Macedonia, Memnon had everything he needed to sustain a siege indefinitely. Every day the siege dragged on worked in his favour. Every week Alexander's men camped before these walls without breaching them was a week his treasury bled, his soldiers grew tired, and the Greek city-states back home had more time to be stirred into rebellion by Persian agents and Persian gold. Memnon also had something that no wall and no moat could manufacture: the absolute confidence of a man who knows he has chosen his ground well. He had been preparing Halicarnassus for exactly this moment. He had reinforced the walls, he had deepened the moat, he had stocked the magazines with arrows, stones, and artillery bolts in quantities sufficient for a prolonged siege. He had positioned his best troops at the critical points and given his officers clear, explicit orders. When Alexander arrives, you do not simply defend, you attack, you sortie, you bleed them, you burn their engines, you deny them every small victory. You make every foot of ground they gain cost them more than it is worth. You do not beat Alexander by sitting behind your walls and hoping he runs out of patience. You beat him by turning his siege into a grinding, exhausting, demoralizing war of attrition that eats his army from the outside in. Alexander, meanwhile, was on the march south. He had swept through Caria with typical Macedonian speed, liberating Greek settlements as he went, granting autonomy and exemption from taxation to towns that opened their gates, and winning the hearts of the Carian population with a stroke of political brilliance that has not always received the attention it deserves. Among those who came to Alexander as he moved south was a woman named Ada, the rightful ruler of Caria, who had been deposed by her brother Pixodarus under Persian pressure and confined to a minor fortress. She came to Alexander and offered him the city of Alinda as a base of operations. Alexander did something remarkable in return. He adopted her as his mother, formally restoring her as Queen of Caria and guaranteeing her rule under Macedonian authority. This was not sentiment. This was strategy. With Ada ruling Caria in his name, every Carian who had resented Persian interference now had a reason to support the Macedonian cause. Alexander was not just conquering territory. He was building an empire with political intelligence as well as military force. But when the walls of Halicarnassus finally appeared on the horizon, massive, ancient, and uncompromising, the politics fell away. Alexander looked at what Memnon had built, and he understood immediately that there would be no political surrender here, no frightened satrap opening his gates. no population clamouring for liberation. What stood before him was the full weight of Persian military power, concentrated in the most defensible position on the coast, commanded by the one man on earth who knew exactly how Alexander fought. Alexander made camp approximately half a mile southeast of the city walls. He ordered his cavalry to scout the perimeter and his engineers to begin their assessments. The Macedonian sappers, the engineers, the specialists, the men whose job it was to turn the science of destruction into something systematic, walked the length of the moat and the walls and came back with their reports. The numbers were not encouraging. The moat was too wide and too deep to rush across with ladders. The walls were too tall and too thick for any direct assault. The towers were perfectly positioned to deliver overlapping fields of fire on any approach, and the harbour at the city's back made a starvation siege mathematically impossible. There was only one way in. Alexander would have to fill the moat, push his siege towers across the newly levelled ground, and use his battering rams to break down the walls, while every single defender inside Halicarnassus rained fire, rocks, arrows and burning pitch down onto the heads of his men from walls that towered above them. To take this city, Alexander was going to have to earn it inch by bloody inch, under conditions specifically designed by the most capable military mind he had ever faced, at the cost of hundreds, possibly thousands, of his best soldiers. He ordered the assault to begin. The first thing Alexander did was probe the defences. He did not launch a full assault immediately. That was not how he operated. Alexander was methodical when the situation demanded it, and the situation at Halicarnassus demanded it absolutely. He sent forward reconnaissance parties to test the walls at different points, to identify weaknesses, to draw fire and observe where the defenders were strongest and where they were thinnest. What came back was not encouraging. The walls were fully manned at every approach. The defenders were disciplined, well supplied, and ready. There was no weak point, no crumbling section, no unguarded gate. Memnon had done his work thoroughly. Alexander made his first move by marching his army around to the northwest of the city toward the Myndus Gate. His calculation was straightforward. If he could take the smaller satellite town of Myndus, which sat on the coast a few miles to the northwest, he would secure an additional harbour of his own and tighten his grip on Halicarnassus from another angle. He moved under the cover of darkness, bringing his forces up quietly against the walls of Myndus and hoping for a fifth column inside the city. Sympathisers, who had reportedly agreed to open a gate for him. He waited. The gate stayed shut. No one came. The traitors inside either lost their nerve or had never existed. Alexander had marched his army through the night for nothing. Frustrated but undeterred, he launched an impromptu assault on the walls of Myndus directly. Without siege equipment, without preparation, his men tried to pull apart the old walls with their bare hands, tearing at the ancient stones with whatever leverage they could find. They managed to bring down a single tower. But one tower was not enough, and before Alexander could exploit even that small breach, Memnon responded, Persian ships appeared in the harbour, landing fresh reinforcements directly into Myndus, and Alexander's unsupported assault was repelled. He pulled his army back. Myndus had held. It was a small failure in the larger context of the siege, but it mattered. It had cost him time, energy, and the cover of night that he could not get back. He returned to his main camp to the southeast of Halicarnassus and began the real work of the siege. The engineers took over. The central problem was the moat. That vast engineered killing ground that Memnon had carved around the city walls was the single greatest physical obstacle between Alexander's army and the walls it needed to reach. Until that moat was filled, or at least partially bridged, there was no way to bring up the siege towers, no way to position the battering rams, and no way to mount any kind of serious assault on the main walls. Everything depended on crossing that trench, and crossing that trench meant putting men into the open, within easy range of every archer, every catapult, every artillery piece, and every defender on the walls above, for however long it took to shovel enough earth and rubble into a ditch roughly 40 to 45 feet wide and more than 20 feet deep to make it passable. The men who drew this assignment were not volunteers. They were ordered forward in rotation, because the casualty rate among men working at the edge of that moat was ferocious. Memnon had positioned his artillery, his stone-throwing catapults and bolt-shooting ballistae, at carefully calculated angles along the walls, and the moment Macedonian soldiers appeared within range, the machines opened up. The sound of it was constant and terrifying, the deep thud of torsion engines releasing, the high, shrieking whistle of heavy bolts cutting the air, the thunderous crack of boulders landing among packed groups of men. Soldiers who had charged Persian cavalry at the Granicus without flinching found themselves flinching here, because at least at the Granicus you could see what was coming and you could move. Here, crouching at the edge of a moat with a shovel or a basket of rubble in your hands, you could not move. You had a job to do, and you had to stand there and do it and hope the next stone did not find you. The archers on the walls added to the torment. Halicarnassus was defended in part by Carian and Persian archers of considerable skill, and they had an almost perfect firing solution onto the men working at the moat's edge. A man bending to shovel earth presents his back and his neck. A man carrying a basket of rubble cannot hold a shield. The Macedonians improvised. They organised rotating shield bearers whose only job was to crouch over the working men and absorb the incoming arrows while the soldiers beneath them dug. It worked, partially. But shield bearers got tired, shields got shattered by artillery, and the arrows kept coming in their thousands, all day, every day, as long as the sun was up. At night, Memnon lit torches along the walls to deny his attackers the cover of darkness, and the archers kept shooting by torchlight, targeting the sounds and shapes of men still working at the moat's edge in the dark. The physical labour itself was staggering. To fill enough of that moat to create a viable approach for the siege towers, Alexander's engineers calculated they needed to move enormous quantities of earth, rubble and stone. The fill material had to come from somewhere, which meant teams of men were simultaneously digging up the earth of the surrounding landscape, loading it into baskets, carrying those baskets to the moat's edge under fire, dumping the material in, and retreating to do it again. Hour after hour, day after day, in the burning heat of a southwest Anatolian summer, where temperatures regularly climbed well above 30 degrees Celsius, and the sun beat down on men wearing bronze helmets and carrying shields. Dehydration, heat exhaustion, and infection from arrow wounds killed men just as surely as the missiles themselves. The camp surgeons were busy from the first day and never stopped being busy. What made this doubly gruelling was the psychological dimension. These were men who had trained their entire lives to fight in the open, in the phalanx, in the cavalry charge, in the screaming violence of a pitched battle where skill and courage meant something. They were not labourers, they were warriors, and being put to work like slaves, filling a ditch under constant bombardment, with no chance to fight back in any meaningful way, ground at their morale in a way that no battle could. You can charge at an enemy and feel brave. You cannot feel brave crouching under a shield holding a basket of dirt, while rocks the size of your head rain down from walls 50 feet above you. The Siege of Halicarnassus attacked not just the bodies of Alexander's men, but their identities as soldiers, and Memnon understood this perfectly. Every day they spent at that moat without reaching the walls was a day their confidence eroded and his defenders' confidence grew. Alexander understood it too. He moved among his men constantly during this phase of the siege, something the ancient sources are consistent about. He was visible at the front within range of the walls, watching the work, talking to the soldiers, sharing the danger with them in a way that commanders of his era rarely did. His physical presence in the line of fire was not bravado. It was management. These men would tolerate conditions no rational human being should tolerate because Alexander was standing right there beside them tolerating the same conditions. His personal courage was the glue that held his army together during the grinding, miserable weeks at the moat. Slowly, at enormous cost, the moat began to fill. Not quickly enough to prevent casualties, not smoothly enough to prevent setbacks, with Persian sorties sending parties of soldiers out through the gates at night to scatter the fill material, dig out what had been deposited, and kill the guards left to protect the work. But bit by bit, with the relentless grinding persistence that was one of Alexander's defining characteristics as a general, the moat shrank. The gap between his army and the walls of Halicarnassus got smaller, and as it did, Memnon escalated. The Persians began deploying their own siege artillery, the catapults and ballistae positioned on the towers and the walls, not just against the men working at the moat, but against any concentration of Alexander's troops within range. Macedonian officers trying to conduct reconnaissance were targeted specifically. Artillery officers and engineers, irreplaceable specialists who could not simply be replaced by promoting a spearman from the ranks, were singled out and killed wherever they were identified. This was not random fire. This was directed, intelligent suppression designed to degrade the quality of Alexander's engineering operation by eliminating the men who knew what they were doing. It was, in modern terms, targeted, counter-battery and counter-staff fire, and it worked. Alexander lost skilled men he could not easily replace, and every specialist killed stretched the remaining engineers thinner and slowed the pace of the work. Meanwhile, inside the city, Memnon was working on something else. He was watching the Macedonian siege preparations with the careful eye of a man who had been thinking about this problem for months, and what he saw told him something important. Alexander's siege towers, the massive wooden machines that would eventually have to be pushed forward across the filled moat to provide a platform for battering rams and assault troops, were under construction a safe distance behind the Macedonian lines. They were enormous structures, the kind of war machines that took teams of skilled carpenters weeks to build, requiring specific timber, specific hardware, and specific engineering knowledge to assemble correctly. Once built, they were practically irreplaceable in the field. A siege tower destroyed was weeks of work gone, weeks of momentum lost, and a powerful psychological blow to the army watching it burn. Memnon filed that information away. His time would come. As the weeks wore on and the moat gradually agonizingly filled, the relationship between besieger and besieged settled into a brutal rhythm. Macedonian working parties went forward at dawn. The walls responded with fire. The working parties pressed on, crouching under shields, moving earth, bleeding and dying. By midday the heat was savage and both sides reduced the intensity of their activity, simply because men could not function at full capacity in that sun. By afternoon the work resumed. At dusk the Macedonians pulled back their most exposed parties, and the city walls blazed with torchlight through the night, keeping the defenders alert and the attackers visible. It was during this phase that Alexander attempted his first serious escalation. With sections of the moat now sufficiently filled to allow approach, he ordered his engineers to begin advancing a section of the siege apparatus toward the walls. Specifically, he wanted to test the strength of the defences near the Triple-moat gate on the eastern side of the city, a point where his engineers believed the walls might be more vulnerable to battering. The advance was covered by massed arrow fire from Macedonian archers and by the shields of the hyperspists, Alexander's elite infantry, who formed the personal guard of the king himself. These were the finest soldiers in the Macedonian army. Professionals in the deepest sense of the word, men who had trained for years specifically for close-quarter shot combat, and who could hold a shield formation under fire with a discipline that bordered on mechanical. The test assault pushed forward under this cover and reached the walls in the sector near the Triple-moat gate. The battering rams made contact. Stone chips flew as the iron-headed rams swung and struck, the rhythmic boom of iron on ancient masonry echoing out across the killing ground between the armies. The defenders on the wall above responded with everything they had, pouring burning material over the ram shelters, dropping massive stones designed to crush the ram heads, firing volleys of arrows into the men operating the machines at near point-blank range. The casualties among the ram crews were severe. And then Memnon made his first aggressive counter-move. The gates of Halicarnassus swung open. Not all of them, just one. And through that gate poured a sortie, a formed, disciplined fighting party of Persian and mercenary soldiers with a specific objective. They were not trying to break the siege. They were not trying to rout the Macedonian army. They were going after the equipment. The sortie drove straight for the battering rams and the nearest siege engines, carrying torches, carrying incendiary materials with orders to burn as much as they could before the Macedonians could respond. The move was fast, violent, and precisely targeted. Alexander's men responded quickly. They always responded quickly because speed of response was one of the things Alexander drilled into his army relentlessly. The sortie was driven back before it could do catastrophic damage, the Persian and mercenary troops fighting their way back to the gate under pressure from the Macedonian counter-response, leaving bodies behind on the ground outside the walls, but they had done some damage. They had made their point. And more than the physical damage, they had delivered a message that Memnon intended Alexander to read very clearly. Every time you push your machines forward, I will come out after them. Every machine you build, I will try to burn. Every inch you gain, I will make you pay for twice over. Alexander had faced resistance before. He had faced fortified cities before. He had even faced siege conditions before. But he had never faced an enemy commander who was simultaneously this intelligent, this aggressive, this patient, and this well-supplied. The moat was filling. The walls were taking damage. But the casualties were mounting, the pace was punishing, and the man on the other side of those walls was nowhere near broken. He was, if anything, growing more dangerous as Alexander got closer, and the worst of the siege, the moment that would push Alexander's famous composure to its absolute limit, had not yet come. It was coming, though. And it was going to arrive at night, carried on the smoke of burning timber and the screams of men who had worked for months on machines that were now, in the space of a single terrifying hour, turning to ash. Before we get to that, because what happens next is one of the most dramatic nights of the entire campaign, I want to take a brief moment to talk to you about something that actually matters to me personally, and I think it should matter to you too. I use NordVPN, not because I was told to mention it, but because when you spend as much time as I do deep in historical archives, research databases, academic journals, and source libraries from around the world, you quickly learn that where you are determines what you can access. Geo-restrictions are real. Privacy online is not guaranteed. And frankly, when you are building something, a channel, a business, a body of creative work, the last thing you need is your data being harvested, your connection being monitored, or your access to research being blocked because of where you happen to be sitting. NordVPN gives me one secure, encrypted connection, regardless of where I am or what I'm accessing. It is fast enough that it does not slow down the workflow, and it is simple enough that I actually use it rather than forgetting it is there. If you value your privacy online, and today you absolutely should, go check it out. The link is in the description, and honestly, if you choose to subscribe through that link, you are also directly supporting this channel and making it possible for me to keep putting this kind of production together. This channel runs on research, time, and the support of people who give a damn about history done properly. NordVPN is one of the ways you can make that happen. Now, back to Halicarnassus, because the night is about to get very dark, very loud, and very, very hot. The siege had found its rhythm, and it was a brutal one. Every morning Alexander's engineers pushed forward. Every afternoon the walls of Halicarnassus answered with fire and stone. Every night the Macedonian camp dressed its wounds, counted its dead, and prepared to do it all again at dawn. The ditch was being filled. Sections of the outer wall were beginning to show damage from the battering rams. The machines were doing their work, slowly, at enormous cost, but doing it. And somewhere behind those walls, in the command centre of the most fortified city on the western coast of the Persian Empire, Memnon of Rhodes was watching all of this and thinking. He was always thinking. That was the thing about Memnon that made him so extraordinarily dangerous. Lesser commanders react. Memnon anticipated. He did not wait to see what Alexander would do, and then decide how to respond. He was already 3 moves ahead, mapping the consequences of the siege's trajectory, calculating when and where and how to strike. He could see the outer wall taking damage. He could see the moat gradually filling. He knew with the precision of an experienced siege commander that if he allowed Alexander to continue at this pace without interruption, the outer defences would eventually fail. Not today, not next week, but eventually. And Memnon had not survived this long, and this successfully, by waiting for the inevitable to arrive. So he hit back, hard, and he hit back the way he always preferred to hit back, not by sitting behind his walls absorbing punishment, but by going outside them. The first major sortie came when Alexander pushed his siege engines, his great wooden towers and battering rams, forward to the section of wall near the Melasa gate on the western side of the city. The engines advanced under cover of massed Macedonian arrow fire, protected by teams of shield bearers and escorted by infantry. They reached the wall. The rams began to work. Stone dust rose in clouds as iron heads crashed repeatedly into the ancient masonry. A section of wall shuddered. A merlon crumbled. The Macedonians on the ground below looked up at the damage and felt something they had not felt in weeks at this hellish city. The first cautious stirring of the hope. Then the gates opened. A formed body of Persian and mercenary troops poured out through the Mylassa gate in a disciplined counterattack. These were not panicked men making a desperate last-ditch charge. They were organised, equipped, and purposeful, coming out in formation with specific orders and specific targets. They drove hard for the siege engines, carrying torches and incendiary materials, fighting through the Macedonian infantry screen that stood between them and the machines. The fighting in the open ground between the gate and the siege engines was ferocious. Close quarters, brutal, neither side able to use their advantages of range or formation effectively in the press of bodies and the noise and the dust. Macedonian infantry slammed into the sortie with spears and swords. The Persian and mercenary troops fought back with equal desperation, knowing that if they failed to reach the machines they had come out for nothing, and outside those walls there was no safety and no second chance. The Macedonians drove them back. The sortie failed to reach the siege engines and was forced back through the gate, leaving its dead on the ground outside the walls. Alexander's men had held. The machines were intact. The rams were still working. But Memnon had not expected to win that exchange. He had been watching something. He had been watching how Alexander's defensive screen was positioned, where the gaps were, how quickly the Macedonian reaction force could be organised and brought to bear. He was, in the language of modern military intelligence, conducting a reconnaissance in force, testing the enemy's responses, mapping the patterns, identifying the timing windows he needed. A few days later, Alexander brought his siege engines forward again, this time toward the section of wall that had taken the heaviest battering. He was personally present at the front, supervising the work, as he almost always was. The rams were positioned, the towers were moved forward, and then, from two directions simultaneously, Memnon's forces struck. One group of defenders came out through the gap in the damaged wall itself, directly through the breach that Alexander's rams had created, which was an extraordinary piece of tactical aggression, using the very evidence of Alexander's progress as the exit point for a counterattack. The second group came out through the triple gate, the triple-on, on the other side of the siege works, hitting the Macedonians from a direction they had not fully anticipated at that moment. The two-pronged attack was simultaneous, coordinated, and designed to split Alexander's defensive response, to force him to fight on two fronts at once and make it impossible to concentrate his strength at either point. For a terrifying few minutes, according to the ancient sources, the situation came perilously close to disaster. Alexander's men near the breach in the wall were fighting in confined, rubble-strewn ground against troops coming directly at them through what should have been a Macedonian-controlled gap. The group coming through the triple-on hit the outer edge of the Macedonian siege works and drove hard into the men there. The confusion of a two-directional surprise attack in the semi-darkness of the late afternoon, with dust, noise, smoke from incendiary materials being hurled at the siege engines, and the screams of wounded men in every direction, pushed even Alexander's disciplined veterans close to the edge of their cohesion. What saved the day was the veterans themselves, the older Macedonian soldiers, men who had been fighting since Philip's campaigns, men who had been in desperate scrapes before and survived them, held their ground and steadied the line without waiting for orders. Alexander threw his best troops in to stabilize the breach point, and the sortie was eventually driven back with heavy losses on both sides. 170 of Memnon's men died outside the walls in this engagement. Macedonian casualties were significantly lighter in killed, but nearly 300 men were wounded, a serious toll for a force that could not easily replace losses this far from home. The machines survived that attack, but the physical damage was less significant than the psychological one. Memnon had demonstrated conclusively and undeniably that his garrison was not passive. He was not going to let Alexander batter his walls into rubble without paying for every stone. Every sortie cost the Macedonians blood, time, and nerve was the currency that mattered most in a prolonged siege. Men who have been surprised twice start to become cautious. Men who have been surprised twice at night start to become afraid of the dark. The night assault, when it came, was the worst of all of them. The exact timing is debated by ancient sources, but Arrian and Diodorus both describe a major nocturnal action that became the defining moment of the siege's middle phase. Memnon's garrison had, over the weeks of the siege, been constructing something of their own inside the walls. A wooden tower, tall and substantial, positioned specifically to counter Alexander's siege towers and to serve as a forward fire platform. They had also carefully stockpiled incendiary materials, bundles of resinous wood, oil, pitch, and other accelerants, positioned near the exits that faced Alexander's siege engine park. On a night that the sources describe as dark and still, the kind of Mediterranean summer night where the heat of the day lingers in the earth long after the sun goes down and the air sits heavy and close, Memnon's men made their move. Sometime around the second watch of the night, when the Macedonian camp was at its least alert, and the men on guard were fighting the heaviness that comes with deep darkness and accumulated exhaustion, the gates opened again. But this time it was not a fighting sortie in the conventional sense. This was an arson mission, carried out by men who knew exactly what they were going after, and exactly how to set it ablaze. Two columns moved simultaneously, one for the wooden siege tower that Memnon's men had themselves built as a countermeasure, and another group heading for the most critical of Alexander's siege engines positioned near the walls. They carried fire, and they moved fast. The guards at the Macedonian siege engine positions were caught badly off guard. Some were sleeping. Others heard the attack too late to organise an effective response before the first flames caught. The incendiary materials the Persian and mercenary soldiers carried were designed to burn hot and fast. Not the slow, reluctant smoulder of damp wood, but the roaring, explosive ignition of pitch-soaked material catching fire in open air. The siege engines went up fast. The great wooden towers that Alexander's carpenters had spent weeks constructing, that had been pushed forward under fire at the cost of men's lives, that were the central instruments of the entire siege strategy. They caught and they burned with a violence that lit up the sky above Halicarnassus like a second sunrise. The alarm spread through the Macedonian camp in seconds. Men came awake to the sound of crackling fire and the orange glow against the darkness and ran for their weapons. Alexander himself was up immediately. The ancient sources are consistent that he was always one of the first on the scene when his camp was in crisis, and he led his counterattack personally, driving forward into the chaos near the burning engines, killing the arsonists he could catch, driving the rest back toward the walls. But the fire was already beyond saving. Buckets of water and sand, teams of men beating at the flames with cloaks and shields, could not overcome what pitch and oil and bone-dry summer timber produced when fully alight. The towers burned. The carefully constructed wooden assault platforms, the months of engineering labour, the machines that Alexander had relied upon to give his men a height advantage at the walls, they were gone. By the time the fire was under control, the sky above the siege camp was full of smoke and sparks, and Alexander was standing amid the wreckage of his siege apparatus looking at ash where his engines had been. The ancient sources differ on the precise scale of the losses that night, but what all of them agree on is what the burning of the towers represented. It was the most significant tactical reversal Alexander had suffered to this point in his campaign. It was not a defeat in the conventional sense. His army was intact, his camp was secure, and Memnon's sortie force had been driven back inside the walls. But Alexander had lost something that could not be quickly replaced in the field. He had lost momentum. He had lost the accumulated labour of the entire siege. And he had lost, for perhaps the first time in his campaign, the comfortable feeling of being the one driving events forward. Those who were close to Alexander in the aftermath of the night battle described him as furious, not the performative, controlled anger he sometimes displayed for effect, the calculated rage that he turned on subordinates or enemies as a tool of domination. This was something rawer, genuine frustration from a man who was not accustomed to being outmanoeuvred. He had marched around Myndus and got nothing. He had bled his men, filling the moat for weeks. He had pushed his engines forward under constant fire at great cost. And now, in a single night, the most critical instruments of his siege had been turned to cinders by a man who had not even tried to break out of the city, just reached out, burned what mattered most, and pulled his hand back inside the walls. It was, as a piece of tactical thinking, close to perfect. And Alexander knew it. He ordered the engines rebuilt. There was no other option. The siege could not proceed without them, and abandoning the siege was unthinkable, not just strategically, but personally. Halicarnassus was the test. If he walked away from it, every fortified city on the coast would know that Alexander the Great could be made to flinch. The engineers went back to work. More timber was sourced. More hardware was fabricated. The whole, exhausting process of construction began again, while the walls of Halicarnassus stood above it all, intact and defiant. But the city was changing inside. Memnon's brilliant defence had come at a price that the sources sometimes understate. Every sortie that poured out through those gates lost men. Every counterattack that drove the Macedonians back also bled the garrison. The walls were absorbing enormous punishment from Alexander's artillery and his battering rams. Sections of the outer defences were crumbling, and while Memnon's engineers worked frantically to repair what was damaged, they could not fully keep pace with the sustained mechanical assault. The garrison's ammunition stocks were being depleted. The fresh troops that the Persian fleet was ferrying into the harbour were being consumed by the fighting faster than they could be replaced, and perhaps most critically, the wall between the towers that had given the defenders the most commanding field of fire over the siege works had now partially collapsed, leaving a gap in the defences that Alexander's engineers noted with intense interest. The new siege engines, when they were ready, were pushed forward again. The rams returned to the walls, and the damage resumed, grinding and relentless, the way only Macedonian siege warfare under Alexander could grind. Not fast, not elegant, but absolutely unstoppable in its persistence. Another section of wall shuddered. Another tower cracked. Another piece of the outer defensive ring of the greatest fortress on the coast began to come apart. Memnon looked at the state of his defences. He looked at the casualty lists from the sorties. He looked at the remaining stocks of ammunition and supplies in the magazines. And he began, with the cold clarity that had defined his entire military career, to think about what came next. Not how to win. He knew by now that the walls would not hold indefinitely. He was thinking about something else, something far more important than the walls, and far more damaging to Alexander than simply losing a city. He was thinking about how to take his army away intact, how to deny Alexander the satisfaction of capturing the garrison, how to make sure that when Halicarnassus finally fell, it fell in a way that gave Memnon the freedom to continue the war from the sea, to carry the fight to the Aegean, to threaten Greece itself, and to give the Persian king the time and the resources to rebuild his western strategy on a foundation that Alexander could not smash with a battering ram. He was thinking about fire. We are going to pause for one more moment before the final act, because what is coming is the end, and it deserves your full attention. If you are watching this and you want to carry a piece of this history with you, we have the apparel to do it properly. The Wars in History store has the gear that means something. The phalanx design, the formation that made Macedonia the greatest military force the ancient world had ever seen. Mollon Labe, the two words that defined Spartan defiance at Thermopylae and echo through military culture to this day. The Anabasis route, tracing the march of the 10,000 across the ancient world, and the Battle of Salamis, the naval engagement that saved Greek civilization from Persian conquest. Every piece is made for people who take history seriously, not as decoration but as identity. The link is in the description. Go check it out, represent the history you love, and know that every purchase directly supports this channel and makes productions like this one possible. Now, back to Halicarnassus. Because the city is about to burn. It is deep into the siege now. The weeks have piled up into months. The ground around Halicarnassus is scarred and churned beyond recognition. A wasteland of filled trenches, broken siege equipment, abandoned arrow shafts, blood-stained earth, and the shallow graves of men who came here from Macedonia and never made it home. Alexander's rebuilt engines are forward again, working methodically against the damaged outer wall. The moat has been largely bridged. The wall between the two towers that Alexander's engineers had identified as the most vulnerable point is critically weakened, its stones cracked and loosened by weeks of sustained battering. The garrison has been fighting magnificently, but the numbers are moving in only one direction now, and Memnon can see it as clearly as anyone. Inside the city the mood has shifted. Not broken. Memnon's men are professionals, and professionals do not simply collapse when the arithmetic turns against them, but there is a quality to the defence now that is different from the early weeks, when the moat was intact and the walls were untouched, and every Macedonian who approached them was cut down at range. The sorties have been costly. The repeated close quarters fighting in the breach zones and at the gate approaches has ground down even the best units in the garrison. The engineers patching the damaged wall sections are working with diminishing material and diminishing time. The defenders on the walls above the siege works are burning through their arrow stocks, and artillery bolts faster than the fleet can replenish them. Halicarnassus is still standing, but it is standing the way a man stands when he has taken too many blows, on will and nerve alone, with the body beginning to fail beneath him. What Memnon needed was time. What Alexander gave him, almost accidentally in a way that neither man could have predicted or planned, was the trigger that ended the waiting. Arrian, the most reliable ancient source on Alexander's campaigns, records what happened next with a detail that is almost too strange to be invented, which is precisely why historians tend to believe it. Among Alexander's forces besieging Halicarnassus were soldiers from the regiment of Perdiccas, one of Alexander's senior Macedonian commanders. Some of these soldiers, billeted in their camp after the grinding misery of another day's work at the walls, had been drinking. The ancient sources are direct on this point. They were not slightly over-refreshed. They were drunk. And in the way that drunk men in armies throughout all of human history have done, they started talking about what men talk about when they have had too much wine and too little sleep, and too many weeks of being afraid and exhausted. They started talking about glory. The conversation, according to Arrian, turned into a kind of contest of bravado. Two soldiers in particular, their individual names are not preserved, which is one of history's small cruelties, because these two anonymous infantrymen were about to change the course of the entire siege, began to argue about courage, about who was brave enough, about whether real Macedonian soldiers sat in camp while the walls opposite them still stood. The argument escalated. The wine was still going. And then, in a decision that was equal parts magnificent and catastrophically stupid, the two men grabbed their weapons and walked out of camp toward the wall, not toward a gate, not toward the breach that Alexander's rams had been working on. They walked directly at the section of wall near the damaged zone between the towers, the section that the engineers had identified as the weakest point, and they attacked it. Two drunk soldiers, in the middle of the night, against the walls of the most heavily defended city on the coast of the Persian Empire. What happened next is one of those moments where history and chaos become indistinguishable from each other. The commotion the two soldiers made woke their tent companions, who, being soldiers, and therefore instinctively responding to the sound of combat, grabbed their own weapons and went to help. Those men woke others. Those others called to the men nearest them. Within minutes, what had started as two men stumbling toward a wall in the dark had become an unplanned, uncoordinated, completely unauthorized assault by a growing body of Macedonian infantry on the most vulnerable point in the Halicarnassus defences. The defenders on the wall above responded with everything they had. Arrows came down in sheets. Stones were hurled from the towers. The men below, now several hundred strong and still growing, driven forward by the mob momentum of soldiers who had spent weeks being told to wait and were finally, even insanely, doing something, pushed into the damaged zone at the base of the wall and began fighting. The noise was enormous. Screaming men, crashing masonry, the crack of stones against shields, the wet sounds of arrows finding flesh. The watch commander on the Macedonian side heard it and sent runners to Alexander immediately. Alexander woke to the report and grasped the situation instantly. The assault was not authorized, it had not been planned. His engineers had not positioned the full siege apparatus to support it, and his covering forces were not in place. Everything about the tactical situation was wrong, but there were hundreds of his men at the wall right now in the dark, fighting without support, and if he did not reinforce them immediately, they were going to be annihilated. He made the only decision a commander of his instinct could make. He dressed, took his weapons, and went forward himself. He sent his most organized and reliable units, the Hypaspists and the Agrianians, his elite light infantry, forward at a run to support the breach attempt, then followed directly behind them at the head of whatever additional forces could be mustered quickly. The assault that had begun as a drunken brawl was now, within the span of perhaps 20 minutes, a full Macedonian assault on the weakest point of the outer wall. The section of wall between the damaged towers gave way. Under the combined pressure of the accumulated battering it had already absorbed, and the new assault now pressing directly against it, the masonry finally cracked and collapsed inward, opening a gap through which Macedonian soldiers poured in the darkness, stumbling over rubble, screaming and fighting, pushing deeper into the city with the wild energy of men who had waited too long and were now finally violently through. The fighting inside the walls of Halicarnassus was unlike anything that had preceded it. Everything outside the walls had been military science: engineering, artillery, organised sorties, calculated assault preparation. What happened inside the walls was something else entirely. It was street warfare in the oldest and most savage sense of the term. Narrow streets barely wide enough for 2 men abreast. Buildings that loomed on both sides, their upper stories used by defenders to rain missiles down on men fighting below. Every doorway a potential ambush. Every corner a place where a counter-attacking group of spearmen or swordsmen could be waiting. The darkness made everything worse. Friend and enemy were barely distinguishable. Commands were lost in the noise. Formations dissolved into individual combats, and the disciplined tactical logic that gave Alexander's army its normal advantages counted for almost nothing in the press and confusion of the fighting. The garrison fought back with everything left in them. This was the moment Memnon's men had been preparing for: the breach, the close-quarters defence, the house-by-house resistance that could, in theory, bleed an attacker dry even after the outer walls had fallen. The Greek mercenaries in the garrison were especially dangerous here. These were men trained in exactly the same tradition as Alexander's own soldiers, fighting with the same weapons, the same formations where the streets allowed it, and the same tactical instincts. Meeting them in the rubble-strewn alleyways of Halicarnassus in the middle of the night was not like fighting through a terrified civilian population. It was like fighting your own army in the dark. Alexander drove forward through it personally. This is not a literary embellishment. It is reported consistently across multiple sources that Alexander was physically present at the breach and in the initial penetration of the city, fighting in the forward line with his men. He had done the same at the Granicus. He had done the same at Miletus. His commanders pleaded with him regularly to stay back, to lead from a position of safety. He consistently ignored them because he understood something about his army that the purely rational calculation of the battlefield risk could never fully account for. His men fought harder, held longer, and pushed further when he was among them. His presence at the point of greatest danger was not recklessness. It was leadership of the most visceral and effective kind. But even Alexander could not force a clean victory out of the chaos of that night. The fighting surged through the streets and back, units getting separated, gains being made in one sector, while men were being pushed back in another, the city's defenders using their intimate knowledge of the streets and buildings to channel the Macedonian assault into killing grounds. Narrow approaches where the numerical advantage Alexander was pushing forward could not deploy effectively, and where a small number of resolute defenders could hold extraordinary numbers of attackers at bay. And then, the fires started. Memnon had given orders. Whether those orders had been pre-planned or were given in real time as the breach developed is something the sources are not entirely clear on, but the outcome is not in doubt. The garrison began to set fire to the buildings nearest the breach points. Not in panic, not in desperation, deliberately, methodically. As a tactical measure, designed to do several things simultaneously: to slow the Macedonian advance by filling the streets with fire and smoke, to deny the attackers the buildings they needed as fighting platforms and rally points, and to destroy anything of military or material value that Alexander might capture. The fires spread through the densely packed wooden buildings of the lower city with terrifying speed. The Mediterranean summer had left everything dry as tinder, and once the fires caught and the wind spread them, they were beyond any individual's ability to control. Alexander was forced to pull his men back from the most heavily burning sectors. The fire was killing his soldiers as surely as Persian arrows, men trapped in burning alleyways, cut off by walls of flame that had sprung up behind them, suffocated by smoke in streets that became ovens within minutes of the buildings on either side catching. He ordered a general withdrawal to the breach points in the area immediately inside the outer wall, consolidating the ground he had taken rather than pressing deeper into an inferno. By dawn, when the worst of the fighting had died down, and the fires were beginning to burn themselves out for want of new material, Halicarnassus looked like the end of the world. Smoke hung over the entire city in a vast column visible for miles across the Aegean. The lower city, the densely populated, commercially vibrant urban core that had made Halicarnassus one of the wealthiest cities in Asia Minor, was largely destroyed. Whole districts were nothing but smoking rubble. Streets that had been crowded and alive the week before were now empty corridors of ash and charred timber. The smell, that particular irreducible smell of fire damage that anyone who has been near it never forgets, hung over everything. And Memnon was gone. This is the part of the story that requires a moment of genuine respect, however grudging, for what he had done. In the hours between the breach and the dawn, while the fighting raged through the lower city and the fires his own men had set spread through the streets, Memnon had executed a withdrawal that ranks among the most disciplined military retreats in ancient history. He pulled his entire surviving garrison, the professional core of it at least, out of the city in good order, not fleeing, not breaking, withdrawing. He moved his best troops to the two citadels that flanked the harbour, Salmacis to the west and Halicarnassus to the east. He got the rest, the bulk of the remaining garrison, the specialist troops, the senior officers, the men he could not afford to lose, onto the Persian fleet waiting in the harbour and evacuated them by sea. By the time Alexander's forces completed their consolidation of the breached outer city and advanced toward the harbour, Memnon was already at sea. His army was intact. His command structure was intact. His relationship with the Persian king and the fleet was intact. He had not been captured. He had not been killed. He had not surrendered. He had given ground the same way he always gave ground, strategically, deliberately, on his own terms, yielding the physical space of Halicarnassus while keeping everything that actually mattered for the continuation of the war. The two citadels, Salmacis and Halicarnassus, were left, with strong garrisons and orders to hold. They were far too powerful for Alexander to reduce quickly, sitting as they did on rocky promontories above the harbour, accessible only by narrow approaches that negated his numerical advantage entirely. He would not take them that season. He would not take them for months. Salmacis, in fact, held out for a year, garrisoned and resupplied by the Persian fleet, a thorn in Alexander's side long after the main city had fallen. Alexander stood in the ruins of Halicarnassus and surveyed what the siege had given him. He had broken the greatest fortress on the western coast of the Persian Empire. He had driven out the most dangerous commander he had ever faced. He had secured the coast at the critical junction point that controlled the southwestern approaches to Asia Minor. These were genuine strategic achievements, and he was right to recognize them as such. His overall campaign could continue. The logic of his coastal strategy, eliminating Persian naval bases one by one to strangle the Persian fleet's ability to threaten Greece, remained sound and would ultimately prove correct, but he had not won a clean victory. He had not captured the city intact. He had not captured Memnon. He had not captured the garrison. He had not secured the harbour. The citadel still held it, denying him its use for his own fleet. What he had conquered was a smoking ruin, a city that had been, by all ancient accounts, one of the finest in the Greek-speaking world, architecturally splendid, commercially wealthy, culturally sophisticated, home to one of the seven wonders of the ancient world, was now a broken, ash-covered shell of itself. He left a force of occupation behind, 3,000 infantry and 200 cavalry under the command of Ptolemy, one of his Macedonian officers, to hold the ruins of the lower city and continue the pressure on the two remaining citadels. He made Ada the formal queen of all of Caria under Macedonian authority, which was politically astute, and secured him the goodwill of the Carian population, and then he left. The campaign had to move on. There were other cities to take, other coasts to secure, other obstacles between him and Darius. He could not afford to sit in the ashes of Halicarnassus and contemplate what it had cost him. But cost him it had. The siege had taken somewhere between 6 weeks and 2 months of some of the most grueling, grinding, costly fighting of his entire campaign. It had swallowed men and machines and time in quantities that Alexander could not easily replace or recover. And it had done something more subtle and perhaps more significant than any of those material costs. It had introduced Alexander the Great to the concept of an opponent he could not simply destroy. He could outlast Memnon at Halicarnassus. He could outbuild him, outfill him, outbleed him, and ultimately outpush him. But he could not beat him, not cleanly, not the way he had beaten Darius's satraps at the Granicus, not the way he would later beat Darius himself at Issus and Gaugamela. Memnon did not lose at Halicarnassus the way armies lose. catastrophically, utterly, with the commander captured or dead and the force shattered and scattered. He withdrew, he preserved, he survived. And in surviving, he kept alive the one thing that could have derailed Alexander's entire conquest. A strategy that did not require open battle, that operated in the spaces Alexander could not easily reach, that threatened the one vulnerability, Greece, the Aegean, the supply lines, that Alexander could never fully protect from a land campaign in Asia. Memnon went to sea. He assembled the Persian fleet, took command of the Aegean strategy with the full authority and resources of the Persian king behind him, and began the campaign that, if he had lived to complete it, might have undone everything Alexander had built. He took Chios. He brought most of Lesbos over to his side while Mytilene still resisted. He was advancing on the Greek mainland itself, moving through the island chain with a speed and decisiveness that sent genuine panic through the Macedonian administrators Alexander had left behind in Greece. His plan, the plan he had been articulating since before the Granicus, was finally being executed. Stir the Greek city-states into rebellion, cut Alexander's supply lines, bring the war to Macedonia's doorstep while Alexander was thousands of miles away and could not get back quickly enough to stop it. It was the one strategy that could have worked. It was the one threat Alexander could not handle with a cavalry charge or a battering ram. And the man executing it was the most capable military mind of his generation, finally fighting the war on the terms he had always said were correct, with the resources he needed and the freedom to use them. And then, in 333 BC, Memnon of Rhodes died. The cause was illness. The sources describe a sudden sickness that struck him during the siege of Mytilene on the island of Lesbos and killed him within days. He was approximately 47 years old. He died in the field, still campaigning, still fighting for an empire that had consistently undervalued his advice, until it was almost too late, still pursuing the strategy that the Persian satraps had dismissed at the Granicus, and that had cost them everything. He did not live to see Issus, or Gaugamela, or the fall of Persepolis. He did not live to see what happened to the Persian Empire he had served with such extraordinary loyalty and intelligence. When the news reached Alexander, the sources tell us he received it with something close to relief. Not triumph, relief, because he understood better than anyone what Memnon's death meant for his campaign. The Aegean strategy died with him. No Persian commander who followed had either his vision or his capability to execute it. The threat to Greece dissolved. Alexander's flanks were secure. The one man who had truly tested him, who had taken his best machines, burned them to ash, abandoned a magnificent city rather than give him the satisfaction of capturing it intact, and then taken the war to the sea where Alexander could not follow, was gone. The ruins of Halicarnassus smouldered for months. The citadels held. The Persian fleet still patrolled the waters. But the mind that had animated all of it, the strategic intelligence that had made the Siege of Halicarnassus something more than a fortified city's last stand, that was extinguished. Not by a Macedonian spear, not by Alexander's genius, by a fever in a military camp on a Greek island. History, as it so often does, refused to be clean about it. That is the brutal truth of Halicarnassus. Not the story of a triumphant conqueror standing over a conquered city. Not the clean cinematic victory that Alexander's legend usually demands. The story of 2 months of grinding, costly, savage warfare against an opponent Alexander never defeated, only outlasted. A city reduced to ashes by the hands of its own defender. A garrison evacuated intact. A strategy that died not on the battlefield but in a sickbed. And a king, young, brilliant, terrifyingly capable, walking through the smoking ruins of a victory that felt, in every way that mattered, like something far more complicated than winning. Memnon of Rhodes deserves to be remembered, not as a footnote to Alexander's story, not as a Persian servant who held a wall for a few weeks, but as the man who came closer to stopping Alexander the Great than anyone else ever did. He was right about the strategy before the Granicus, he was right about Halicarnassus, and he was right about the Aegean. The tragedy of Memnon is not that he failed. It is that the empire he served kept failing him, right up until the moment history ran out of time for both of them. Alexander went on, of course, south to Lycia, east to Gordium, then to Issus, where he finally met Darius in the open field and shattered him, then to Egypt, then to Mesopotamia, then to the ends of the earth as he understood them. The conquests that followed Halicarnassus were bigger, more famous, more celebrated, but none of them cost him more, measure for measure, than the city on the coast of Caria that Memnon of Rhodes turned into a graveyard and then set on fire on his way out. That is what war actually looks like when both sides are led by exceptional men. Not clean, not glorious, not simple, just enormously costly, relentlessly complicated and settled, in the end, by factors that neither genius nor courage can fully control. Thank you for watching. Thank you for caring about history the way you do. This channel exists because of you, your time, your engagement, your support. It genuinely means everything. If you made it to the end of this video, you are exactly the kind of person this channel was built for. And if you want to be a direct part of making it grow, if you want to help fund the research, the production, the maps, the time that goes into every single one of these scripts, then consider joining the Wars in History membership community on YouTube. Memberships start at just $2.99 a month. That is less than a single coffee. In return, you get access to a community of people who love history as seriously as you do, early access to upcoming topics, and the knowledge that you are directly keeping this channel alive and independent. The join button is right below this video. Come in. The war room is open, and if you enjoyed this video, leave a comment below. Tell me what you thought of Memnon. Did he deserve better from history? I genuinely want to know. Like the video if you found it worth your time, subscribe if you're not already, and I will see you in the next one. The next campaign is already waiting.